The average person is said to spend 15 minutes in the bathroom. Why not take advantage of that time and learn something new? Presenting the 15-minute podcast on weird facts, crazy details, and funny particulars that you'll be able to enjoy while you're taking a on your free time. Welcome to This Shit with Sam Butler. Welcome to another episode of the Shit Podcast. I'm your host, Sam Butler. I'm glad to be back. It's been a few weeks. I'm sorry, y'all. I've been traveling. I don't know if many of y'all have followed me on social media, but excuse me. I've had kind of an eventful few months. I started out, as many of you know, my mom passed away in August, and all the stuff I had lined up was lined up before that happened. So I went ahead and went on with my plans. So I went out to New Orleans for a little while. I was out there celebrating my little brother's birthday. And then after that, I went to Italy, and after that, I came back and went to Laredo and San Antonio. So I've been out of pocket for the last few weeks. And then when I got back, I was overwhelmed with work. I had a lot of work that was stacked up from me being gone so long. And also, I kind of went through a little bit of minor depression, I guess. The reality of losing my mom kind of started to settle in, and so I had a tough time making myself do the podcast. So I apologize to everyone at this moment for being out of pocket, but I did have to kind of take a break from everything. I took a break. I did do some shows in Italy, but when I got home, it was kind of like, okay, I need to stop thinking about everything and kind of slow down a little bit. But here we are back in the studio, and I'm happy to be with you guys. And I once again apologize, but I thank you guys for following the podcast. With that being said, if you don't follow the podcast, if this is your first time watching the podcast, please like and subscribe. Hit the notifications bell. All of these subscriptions help me. Excuse me. Help me get the funding that I need for the production of these videos. With that being said, I want to thank you once again. Today's topic that I chose, I actually came across it in Italy while I was traveling. I didn't know too much about it, as I wasn't a very good student. As many of y'all know, I did go to trade school. That was my thing, but I just was too ADHD, too hyper to sit and actually be a regular student. So I missed out on a lot of the stuff that I should have paid attention to in high school. I excelled in things that were hands-on, like welding, for example, but I didn't do too good in literature. And it wasn't because I wasn't smart enough, which is ironic because I'm doing a podcast which entails a lot of reading, a lot of preparation. And so it's kind of ironic that we're doing this now. But I go to Italy on vacation, and I go to a city called Verona. Now, when I'm in Verona, there's a lot of people that are visiting Verona, and especially down this one particular alleyway. If you take a left-hand turn, I guess depends what side of the street you're coming down. But in my case, I was going down the street, and to the left, there was a bunch of signs that said that's where Juliet's balcony was, where Juliet, the famous Juliet from Shakespeare's play Romeo and Juliet, lives. Now, I was there with my buddy Nick Farrell, and Nick lives in Italy now, so he's like, hey, check it out. That's the balcony where Juliet lived from Shakespeare's play Romeo and Juliet. And I was like, dude, that's a fictional story. This is crazy that there's so many people that are going to look at this balcony, right? And it was kind of weird too, the way it was set up. If you've ever been to Italy and you've ever gone to see that particular balcony, it's like in a courtyard. And I was like, bro, if my girlfriend lived inside that courtyard, it'd be really tough to get in there and interact with her without being spotted, you know? But anyway, we started talking about it, and we started doing some research, and it turns out that in fact, Juliet did exist, but it's not necessarily the Juliet that we think of when we think of Romeo and Juliet. But the character Juliet was based on an actual person, and it was ironic. I mean, I think this is the shit, because to me this was all a fictional play written by an Englishman, you know, and it was a classic story of forbidden love. So we were talking about this, and it turns out that in fact Shakespeare based Romeo and Juliet on a play. Well, it wasn't really a play. It was a poem written by Arthur Brooks. Now, Arthur Brooks was another Englishman who based it on an Italian poem or story, and he wrote some verses called The Tragical History of Romeo and Juliet. This was in 1562. And it was a verse translation of an Italian story. So apparently there was a young woman that lived there, and there was a romance, and a lot of what was found in the Tragical History of Romeo and Juliet was actually what Shakespeare based his famous play on. So in modern terms, it was like there was a script, and Shakespeare wrote the screenplay. And so, although there was no screen, this was an actual play. The Italian story was known as Mariotto Agenziosa in 1476. So this story dates back to 1476. And it had a lot of the plots that are found in Romeo and Juliet. And of course, as in many of the movies and plays and stuff that we see today, there is some creative liberties that William Shakespeare took, and this leads me to like interesting fact. You know, one of the interesting facts about it is that Juliet in the play is only 13 years old, which is kind of like raises your eyebrow. Now, a lot of people have a problem with this because she was only 13. Romeo was 16, according to William Shakespeare edition. But according to the Italian story that it's based on, they were both about the same age. They're both 16. So the question is, why did William Shakespeare change the age to 13? Well, he wanted there to be some sort of, you know, just different people that have discussed the term. And he wanted there to be some sort of element like young love, and she was very young, and she was in love with an older guy, which was very classic of this time period. Now, one of the things that raises eyebrow is that, in a way, it's kind of like, well, was Shakespeare a pedophile? Well, I personally don't think so, because even as late as 100 years ago, 50 years ago, there were still people marrying 13-year-olds. That's basically when they came of age. You know, when women hit puberty, in a lot of the ranches and farms and so on and so forth, they'd marry very young and they start their family young. And we know that it wasn't necessarily based on love. It was more based on grouping together, teaming together to create a family, and also create a business, and also create a livelihood. So back in the olden days, a lot of people would not marry for love. As a matter of fact, love is kind of a modern invention. But in Romeo and Juliet, that's what made Romeo and Juliet such an inspiring story, was that it was a love story in a time when love wasn't that common as far as couples were concerned. Another interesting fact about this is that the first reference to the actual families, the Montagues and the Capulets that are found in Romeo and Juliet, weren't even part of the original Italian story. They actually came out of Dante's poetry. In the early 14th century, the Divine Comedy, he makes references to these two warring Italian families, the Montagues and the Capulets. Well, they did exist, and they were warring, but not necessarily involved with Romeo and Juliet. So it's kind of like the Hatfields and the McCoys in today's time frame, but this was couple hundred years before Shakespeare writes his play. So he kind of took some creative liberties and took pieces from different literary works. Now, another interesting fact is that the most famous line from the play, which many people would know, where it's, "Wherefore art thou Romeo," is kind of confusing, because "wherefore art thou" actually is like not "where is Romeo," but "why is Romeo?" And a lot of people don't understand that. And this is my own opinion, I can see that it's like kind of a questioning, like, why Romeo, right? So that's something that a lot of people have a hard time with. And the literal translation isn't necessarily "wherefore art thou," but "why is there a Romeo?" I could see a young person questioning themselves based on that. Now, here's a really interesting fact that I think is like, it blew my mind when I read about it. And the fact is that one of the most famous things, including in Verona, this town that I visited, was that there's a balcony. Well, the concept of balconies did not exist in England. Therefore, it kind of had to be described. And actually, it wasn't even, it's speculated that it wasn't in the original Shakespearean play, but it was in a different play that was written by Thomas Coryat in 1611, when he talked about how exotic balconies were in other countries. And so the balcony scene wasn't even added till like 1611. But by like 1679, it was kind of part of the culture. And so it was also written in the play, The History and the Fall of Caius Marius, by the playwright Thomas Ottaway in 1679. And that's when he took the play and moved it to Rome. So although the play originally was in Verona, it got rewritten in 1679, it was moved to Rome. So we can see that there's a ton of little weird facts about Romeo and Juliet. Now, also something that's really interesting is exactly what I was mentioning, is that thousands of Valentine's Day cards are written to Juliet each year in Verona. So yes, Romeo and Juliet is a big tourist attraction in this city, and apparently there's tons of people that write Valentine's Day cards to Juliet, which is kind of a romantic thing if you think about it. Now, this is like the royal flush. The main point, I smoke cigars, as many of y'all know, and I have a podcast about cigars with my buddy Luis Munoz. We talk about cigars and what to pair them with. Now, one of the most popular cigars, one of the, I guess, iconic cigars, is actually the cigar that I started smoking when I first started smoking cigars. It's called Romeo and Juliet, Romeo and Juliet. Now, how did the cigar come to be? Well, the cigar came to be, but how did they choose the name for the cigar? That's a very interesting story. As was mentioned in one of, I think it was one of our first episodes in Puros y Pistos podcast, cigar rollers, known as torcedores, would be in the factory rolling cigars on a regular basis, and they would get bored. And so one of the things that the factory owners would do is they would actually hire a reader. Now, the readers would read stories out loud, and they read a lot of classics like Romeo and Juliet and The Count of Monte Cristo, which Monte Cristo is also a different type of cigar. If you're not familiar with cigars, it's a brand of cigar. And so what they would do is they'd have someone read out loud these stories to the guys and girls making cigars, because there's women torcedoras making cigars, and they became popular, and they really enjoyed the characters. So a lot of the cigar lines that exist now, a lot of the cigar brands, are actually based on these literary works, and it's because they became fans of them while sitting at the factory making cigars. And so I think it's a very interesting story. It's interesting to have gone to Verona. It's interesting to have seen where all of this history originated. And like I mentioned, the next time you're at the pub or you're at the with a buddy and you're talking, you want to think about mention Romeo and Juliet, because there's a lot of weird facts and stuff I never would have thought of. So with that being said, that wraps up this episode of the Shit Podcast. I hope you enjoyed it. Thank you guys for joining me one more time. And like I said, I apologize for all of the missed episodes, but we're getting back on track, and hopefully you guys can continue to support our channel. With that, I say goodbye, and we'll catch you on the next one.